You, I'm so charged I need to.
You ready?
Crazy Joker.
All right. You good? All right. So Confederation, the Constitution. The first thing that I want to talk about are some of the treaties that were brokered when the war came to an end. Obviously, the first one, Treaty of Paris, is going to officially end the war. America got way much more land than they had anticipated. They end up getting all the land from the eastern seaboard to the Mississippi, with the exception of Florida, which was controlled by Spain, and Canada, which remained in control. It remained in British hands and ultimately became carved out as British provinces. The two diplomats that brokered the deal were John Adams, Ben Franklin, and John Jay. A follow-up treaty with Britain will occur that will be brokered by John Jay. John Jay is going to be our first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He is going to broker a trade agreement with Britain after the Treaty of Paris. It's like about 10 years later, 11 years later, this treaty is brokered to open up trade. It's also brokered to get British soldiers out of the western frontier. And it is also one more measure to try to keep peace. However, the British continued to break both the conditions of the Treaty of Paris and Jay's Treaty, and that's going to carry us into the War of 1812, which we'll deal with that when we get into Lesson 8. The Pinckney Treaty is negotiated by Thomas Pinckney of South Carolina with the Spanish Foreign Minister Godoy. This treaty was for two reasons. Number one, to parcel out the Florida territory. Florida then does not look like what Florida does now. Florida then was like basically southern Georgia, southern Alabama, southern Mississippi, and all of Florida. So that treaty carved out a portion of southern Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. It also gave the U.S. trade rights on the Mississippi River, but there's a missing piece of the puzzle. What does America really need in order to effectively trade on the Mississippi River? What city do they need? Anyone? It's not in Mississippi. It's in Louisiana. Very good. They need New Orleans. New Orleans. I love it. Nice job. Okay? They need New Orleans. That's like the whole Louisiana purchase. The premise of that was actually to purchase New Orleans, and then they got a better deal because Napoleon, wanted the money. So we'll get into that when we move to Lesson 8 as well. The Treaty of Greenville is an interesting one. After the Revolution ends, and they're cobbling together, this new nation. The war with Native Americans west of Appalachia is not over. There's a new confederation that comes together, made up of tribal members from the Ottawa, the Miami, and the Shawnee, and they end up doing battle in the Ohio Territory with a group of American soldiers known as the American Legion. Have you all ever heard of that before? The American Legion. And the American Legion was led by this Revolutionary War veteran named Mad Anthony Wayne. Are you all familiar with Waynesboro, Virginia? That's the namesake of Waynesboro, Mad Anthony Wayne. They're going to defeat this Native American Confederation in what is called the Battle of Fallen Timbers near Toledo, Ohio. And it leads to this treaty where basically Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois are like pretty much parceled out. The Native Americans get a northern portion of it, and the Americans get the southern portion of it. But shocker, they break the treaty, like within just a few years. By the time the War of 1812 unfolds, like that whole thing fell apart. And it leads to continued fighting with Native Americans all the way up to the War of 1812. So I'll actually be revisiting some of these treaties when we get into lesson 8. So it's just a little bit about the treaties. So this is all the territory that was obtained as a result of the Treaty of Paris, the end of the Revolution. America gains its independence. There's John Jay, first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. This is the land that was parceled to the U.S. through the Pinckney Treaty and trade rights on the Miss. And then that's the demarcation line that was drawn through the Ohio Territory, but ultimately that area along Lake Erie that was set aside for a reservation ultimately gets taken over for economic reasons. So that's a little bit about the treaties. So I tend to mess this up, but moving forward, and I'll probably have a blunder with this because I always do. There's not a year. Maybe this is my year that I don't do this. We are, from this moment forward, we are no longer talking about colonies. They are now what? States. Very good. This process of them becoming states started as early as 1774 and 1775. I mean, we already learned about the Virginia Convention, right? That was held at St. John's Church in Richmond. One of the states that kind of set sort of the standard for this was Massachusetts, because what they agreed to do was like establish an annual session where their lawmakers would meet after they were elected. And then they would do that annually. Do we still do this annually in the States? Yes, we do. When do we do this in Virginia? In the start of the new year, the General Assembly meets to make our what? What does the Virginia General Assembly do for us? Sometimes we like these that they pass, and sometimes we don't. They make our laws, okay? So every state legislature meets annually. Massachusetts started this, and the other states fall in line. All of the states also establish legislatures that are lawmaking bodies. Now, it gets a little tricky, though, because when we're in the midst of this war, the states view themselves as their own little countries. So when they put together the Articles of Confederation, they're purposely made weak. However, there are some really key documents that are going to be written during this era. For example, George Mason, very important guy, Virginian, who authored one of the most important documents of the entire Revolution, the Virginia Declaration of Rights. The Virginia Declaration of Rights not only inspires Jefferson when writing the Declaration of Independence, but that becomes the blueprint that James Madison uses to write the Bill of Rights. This will also inspire Jefferson to write the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Jefferson's 3 proudest accomplishments are on his tombstone. Author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and founder of UVA. Those are his 3 proudest accomplishments. Where are my Wahoos at? Got one Wahoo. And we have a Wahoo that's traveling. So, and now I'll talk about how tech gets established later for my Hokies out there. A lot of people were leery of this, right? They don't know. The Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom becomes a guiding principle for the First Amendment. But everyone's a little leery about these legislative bodies. They're also leery about the loss of their state rights, and that becomes tricky as we move into the framing of the Articles of Confederation. So on the left, we have George Mason. On the right is the Virginia Statute, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, written here in Richmond And often when you see a statue of George Mason, he often has a quill in his hand. We're not done with him. We're going to talk more about him as we head into lesson 8. Really, for the remainder of this lesson and into lesson 8. How are we doing? Am I moving too fast? Is everybody good? Sweet. Okay, creating the Articles. So, the Articles of Confederation were framed in a time of great distress. We got to keep that in mind. This document is written in York, Pennsylvania, while Britain has Philadelphia occupied. All right? This is, again, made weak on purpose because there's a lot of self-interest here. And there are states in this meeting where they're drafting this that have their own goals, right? They're not seeing the governmental situation as one that is united because what are they worried about? Good. They're worried about, like, another monarchy, yeah? So they're like, well, we don't want to get ourselves back in the situation we just got out of. So there's a lot of fear of that. I mean, a lot of people were pretty much like, okay, well, we're going to put a crown on George Washington's head. It's just how it goes. And Washington does, like, something that no one ever did and said, hey, here's my sword. I'm done. It's over. I'm getting back to Mount Vernon. Like a Forrest Gump moment. You ever seen Forrest Gump? So, that really kind of shakes things up, but you have to keep in mind, guys, this thing is approved hastily in the latter part of the war. I don't think anyone necessarily thought that this government was going to go anywhere or do anything. I think most of these people, once the war ended, they didn't know in the spring of 1781 that the war was going to come to an end in the fall. So, again, this isn't a perfect solution, and the founders know that. Really, the only, like, decent achievement that the Articles had was the Northwest Ordinance, but I'm not going to get into that today because that's where we'll start our next lesson, next part of the lesson with the Northwest Ordinances. So that's a little bit about why they adopted the Articles in Yorktown, Pennsylvania, which is now just York, Pennsylvania, not far from Gettysburg. Are you guys familiar with Amish country in PA? It's near there. Anybody been to York before? All right. Kind of like sort of in the middle. All right, this is where we pump the brakes today. The Articles have given the states way too much power. And where are my Hamilton fans at? Okay. Hamilton is from New York, and coming out of this war, Hamilton's like, if we don't figure out the debt crisis, we're not going to make it as a nation. So he's like really pushing, even before the Constitutional Convention meets, what is he pushing for? What to be created? Any ideas? A national bank. Very good. And a Treasury Department. And a lot of people were like, absolutely not. That's far too British. But Hamilton keeps pushing it, and he's like, we got to figure out what we're going to do with the debt here. Because if we don't settle the debt crisis, then we're right to be invaded by Britain or France or who knows what country might go after us if we don't get ourselves together. Also, who do we owe money to? France, Spain, and Holland. And when you owe people money, or you owe banks money, or you owe a credit card company money, what do you pay? Interest. So the interest is going up too, or at least the compounded interest, right? Like on the other side of it. So this is a big problem. So here are your weaknesses. Number one, there's no executive branch, no president. They're leery of that. They feel like, this isn't a big deal because every state has their own executive. Like, for example, who's the executive in the state of Virginia? Our what? Governor. Very good. Virginia and all these states, they've got governors. They have legislatures. They have judicial systems. There is no executive or Supreme Court in the Articles. So there's no one to carry out laws, and there's no one to determine whether they're just. Congress is pitifully weak, right? So it's kind of like, this is kind of a messed up experiment that I did when I taught sixth graders. It was a character building experience in my life. I would have this row be Rhode Island, and I would secretly say, hey, whatever I tell you to vote on, vote no. And then you guys would be Connecticut, and whatever I say, you guys are going to say no. And all of you are Virginia. And I'd be like, who wants to go on a field trip to Busch Gardens? This is kind of cool. And they're like, yeah, freaking out. And Virginia unanimously votes yes. And then you all voted down. And the first thing they said is, that's not what? Fair, right? I didn't take Busch Gardens. I didn't take them on a field trip. But the point was, I got the lesson stuck, right? Because they understood the problem with only one vote in Congress per state. States like Virginia and Pennsylvania had massive populations compared to a Connecticut or a Rhode Island. Does that make sense? You also had to have a 2/3 majority vote to get anything passed. You had to have a unanimous vote to get things amended. It just was not efficient. They couldn't regulate trade, interstate trade from state to state. They had no ability to tax. That was Hamilton's biggest hangout. Because how could you absolve the war debt if you couldn't tax the people? There's no common currency. Who's traveling over the holidays? Where are you going? Oh, yeah, you're going back to Gretna. Anybody? Yeah. Going to New York. Could you imagine in the next couple of days if you had to change your currency 5 times just to get from here to New York? That was the deal. Everybody had their own currency. And what was even sillier was Virginia had some of the strongest currency, but Virginia's currency was actually backed by Spanish shillings. It was senseless. It was crazy. There's no real army to speak of. Why? What has Washington done? He's disbanded them. There's no executive to say, hey, here we go. Here's how the military worked. Hey, Virginia, can we borrow your militia? No? Okay. Hey, Connecticut, can we borrow your militia? Hey, Rhode Island. See, that's a problem. So these are all the reasons this falls apart. But there is a very important moment, arguably one of the most important events in American history that no one knows about, that I'm going to teach you when I see you next. Have you all ever heard of Shays' Rebellion before? Probably not. Maybe a couple of people. But if we bumped into somebody on the street and we were like, tell us a little bit about Shays' Rebellion, they'd probably look at us like we were crazy. But it is arguably one of the most important events in American history that's just totally forgotten about because it will be the nail in the coffin for the Articles. And that is all I have today. All right. Yay. How'd I do? Woo! Awesome. All right. And that's all I've got.